So our next talk is all about CSS. At the big shiny React conference that we hosted, I don't know if you heard about that, we talked a lot about this topic of CSS in JS, right? And we looked at just one of the many, many libraries that are available to you to sort of help you out in writing CSS inside of your components. But there are loads and loads of libraries out there. There's probably more libraries now than there was back at the conference. And it's quite challenging to choose between them. They all have different pros and cons. Some do server-side rendering. Some are nicer to write. Some have CSS files that you can use your current linting, whatever. So to try and separate the wood from the trees, please welcome Faraz Khan.
Hello, I'm still actually setting up, so. We don't want to mirror displays. Oh, I can't see where my mouse is. That's Slack. Sorry. On a scale of 1 to 10, how embarrassing do you reckon this is? Yay, I got there. I'm really sorry about that. Hello, I'm Faraz. I'm a front-end engineer up here. You can think of us as like the Airbnb for like retail space, and we're also hiring. So if you want somewhere new to argue about your favorite text editor, you can come find me at the end. I use Vim, by the way. Sorry. And you can also follow me at Faraz Khan 404. You can see some really carefully chosen retweets of the great things other developers have said, not that I've said, and the occasional picture of a hedgehog. I mean, seriously, look at this hedgehog. It's great. So I'm here to talk about everyone's favorite topic, I'm sure, CSS. I don't know about everyone else, but I think CSS is great because it lets me do cool things with not that much effort. And I kind of feel like building a button today, right? And those of you like familiar with React will probably have seen this kind of scenario before. You have your standard button. It does something fancy when you hover over it. There's a little chevron there. You have a primary style, and sometimes you want to disable it if your users haven't completely filled out a form. So React should be able to take care of this problem like easy, right? It's what it's built for. So we're probably going to need to write some CSS. And yeah, that's it. You just need to write some CSS, and then you're there. No. We could write some CSS, but CSS actually has some problems at scale. And one of those problems is the global namespace. And if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, here's an example of the problem. So you have a button class in your CSS, and you pull in some external style sheet, let's say Bootstrap, for example, and then you've got a bit of a mess on your page. You have no idea what's going on, and nothing looks pretty anymore, and everyone's mad. So what's the solution, right? So in November 2014, Christopher Shadow, or I can't pronounce that second part, but he gave a talk, and he works at Facebook and works on React. He gave a talk entitled CSS and JavaScript. And he acknowledges these issues with CSS, and he proposes a potential solution. So we could define our styles in line, right? That's a solution. That way, your styles are scoped locally to the file in which they're defined. Well, that's not really the best idea. So we can scope our styles to a file. This looks vaguely like CSS. So what you're doing here is you're writing everything in a JavaScript object. But there are some issues with this, which is that pseudo elements are not actually supported by inline styles. So what do you do in that scenario? Well, you don't. So what else can you use? So inline styles, as we've seen, like only partially solve the problem. So there's actually, thankfully, because the React community is so great, there's a lot of alternatives. And some of the options are CSS modules, styled components, and glamorous, right? But which one should you use? There's so much choice. So we can figure this out. We're developers, right? So CSS modules, and this is like a quote from the README. So what this allows you to still write CSS and import that CSS into your JavaScript, and it will take the class names which you define and turn them into unique strings. So you don't have to worry about any namespacing issues. So how do you install it, right? You'd think that you'd have to yarn install something. No, you got to mess with your Webpack config. So I don't know about you guys, but when I think about Webpack, I cringe a little bit. Like I reckon at least 5 people winced when they saw that. But what this is basically saying is when you find a CSS file, treat it as a JavaScript module in a sense, right? And here's my React component. So those of you familiar with React, this should be fine for you, but those not, just remember that like a React component is basically, it's just a function that takes some data and returns a view. That's it, right? So you'll notice I'm importing this module here called class names, and that's really handy for using CSS modules. All it does is it takes some class names and strings them together, because there's only one class name prop available to a React component. I'm importing my CSS as a JavaScript rail, which is a good start, right? And I'm taking some props. So children is going to allow me to render a label. Primary is going to let me know if I want to render the white button or not, and disable lets me know whether I just don't want anyone to touch my button. And there's also a class name prop, right? Ooh, sorry. So what I've done is in the class name prop of my button, I've strung together the styles which I'd like to apply, and I'm conditionally rendering using the and operator the primary styles only when the primary prop is true. And I'm also passing the class name, and that's kind of important because that means that if necessary, I have an escape hatch, right? I can override these styles by passing in a class name. And I've also added an extra div around the label just so it's easier to access. So some CSS, and this is plain CSS, right? There's nothing special or fancy going on here. The only thing to watch out for is you shouldn't really use dashes unless you're familiar with the square bracket notation, because you'll have to use, you'll be importing your styles like css.root, as you saw in the previous example. But we have things that we like about CSS. We have pseudo elements. We can have like hover animations and all that stuff. This is my primary styles, which I'm conditionally adding in the JSX. And we can use CSS for what it's good at, and like telling me if a button's disabled or not, right? Next up is styled components. So styled components uses tag template strings to let you write your CSS inside a JavaScript file. So how do you install styled components? Well, actually, this time you can just straight up install it with Yarn. You don't have to touch Webpack. It's great. So this is a default import from styled components. So you can import styled. And this is that tagged template literal which I mentioned. And what this is doing is it's going to return a React component, and all of the styles defined between the backticks will be injected into that React component. And this also vaguely looks like CSS with some small quirks. So we know that I want a hover animation on my button, right? So how am I going to get to that? So you may notice that, sorry, this is for my pseudo element even. You may notice that there's this weird ampersand symbol hanging around there. And that's because what styled components will be doing is similar to CSS modules. It's going to generate a unique class name, and you don't actually know what that is ahead of time, right? So you need this ampersand to be able to use pseudo elements. But they're still there, which is great. And then finally, we've got Glamorous, which sells itself as maintainable CSS with React. And this was inspired by styled components, and it's maintained by PayPal. Just like styled components, you can just yarn install this. There's nothing to fiddle with Webpack with. Also very similar, you just import a default import from Glamorous. So this is where things start out similar but change slightly. So it's still a function which takes some props, because this is returning a React component, right? And you can still use pseudo elements, but you just have to use quotes around them. So we can still do that. That's good. So which one wins, right? Which should you choose? Did I give you the answer? So let's have a look, right? Let's come back to all our buttons. So we have the first button. OK, that does exactly what I wanted it to do. We have the second button. That also does exactly what I wanted it to do. And we have the third button. That also does exactly what I wanted it to do. OK, so you're probably wondering why. Why did you just take me through all those options, and what do I do? Which one do I pick? You didn't answer my question. Well, I kind of learned it doesn't really matter what you pick. You should try them, figure out what works best for you, because to be honest, the method doesn't really matter. It's how you implement it that does. And at least that's what I've learned in my experience. So I use class names, and I think that works great, but I'm sure the others are great too, and I've kind of played with them. But here are some things I've learned along the way when writing styles in React that I think hold true across whatever module you decide to use. Leave an escape hatch for others, right? Think about that time that you were searching on GitHub, you found the perfect module to install, and it's got all the bells and whistles, and then you install it and you can't change the color. That sucks, right? So you notice all my examples had a class name prop. And what that means is you leave an escape hatch for everyone else to, if they don't think that your button is the greatest button of all time and they need to tweak the styles a little bit, they can do, right? Because the likelihood that you write a button and someone else comes across it and thinks that it's perfect is very small. Be consistent. So I definitely recommend not mixing and matching these options, because you don't want to be the guy who RM'd his Node modules and then had to have your colleague come over and tell you that you're writing margin top camel case instead of dash in your CSS. It's not nice. And then finally, I saw this tweet the other day, and I thought it was hilarious. It says that CSS sucks, basically, because it's globally scoped, but also Redux is good. Right? Yeah, so you're not really done with global CSS. You're still going to need it for things like fonts and stuff. So you can't encapsulate everything, right? So that's what I think should be applied when you're writing styles in React. Leave an escape hatch, should be consistent, and you're still going to need global CSS, right? Thanks. Hello? There's a dude over there with a question. Sure. So I guess I didn't really cover those, but I'm aware that you can. So styled components in Glamorous don't allow you to use any of that functionality, but you can use Sass and less with CSS modules. But I guess to be honest, I've never really found a use case for that kind of functionality. But I know you can use it with CSS modules. That guy.
Hey, how applicable do you think these are into a B2B setup where perhaps you have to make a component that has to roll out across multiple brands, where the styling could be quite different and kind of needs to inherit from a framework as such?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely. Do you mean you're going to be using external libraries, or?
Yeah, kind of. Sorry, I kind of for this, I think these are really good for if you've got a single app that is only used in one place. But say you're building something that has to be reused. Maybe if you've got B2B clients, or you've got something completely different where you just want to reuse it across multiple sites. So you might need it to look very different on one than another.
Sure.
Do you think this kind of setup you can use, or it's better to abstract it?
I'd say it's more than applicable. So that's where the escape hatch comes into it, right? So when you're writing your styles, you always leave yourself a bit of room to override styles if need be. Does that answer your question? No.
Yeah, kind of, I guess. Yeah, then you've got the option to override, right? And that's kind of, you can take that more as a default rather than absolute.
Yeah.
All right, sweet. Thanks.
Cool.
Is there anything in particular that you like and or dislike about each of them?
Good question. So something that can be a bit annoying with, I guess, CSS modules is you're writing your CSS in a CSS file, so you don't have access to JavaScript variables. So let's say you wanted to do something like programmatically update a height variable, right? You can't actually chuck that in your CSS file, but you'd still have to write inline styles, which it has its place here and there. But what I like about CSS modules is that it's still CSS, and like I say, it's a syntax I'm familiar with. I'm not going to find myself accidentally forgetting that I need to use camel case stuff or that I need to wrap things in quotes. Styled components, it's pretty cool. Tag template literals aren't for everyone, I don't think, and it's great that you have access to props, but I get confused about where to store those components. Is it a style? Is it a component? Where does that fit in? I guess I'm set in my old ways. And glamorous, it's not really for me, I guess. I just don't really like writing my styles as JavaScript objects, but that's not really an answer to your question. That's just I just don't like it, to be honest.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Questions? No.
Cool, good, sweet, thanks.